Right, hello. I'm Kane Lewis, leasing manager at Derwent London, as well as being on the BCO NextGen committee. And welcome to a special edition of our series of talks that we're calling Inspirational Leaders, where we look to hear from leaders from across the UK who share stories and highlights from their time in the industry, as well as their top tips on how to develop and achieve career goals. Many of you would have been to previous events that we've held in central London. However, during this period of lockdown and likely continued social distancing, it's our intention to bring these discussions to your screens and hopefully provide some entertainment to help break up your working week. Now, before we delve into the discussion, it's worth saying that obviously both our industry, but also our country is in uncharted territory, and the COVID-19 outbreak is continuing to present a huge challenge for us all. And so we would ask that in return for supporting this event, that you also help support the NHS and provide a donation today. We hope that you can help us by doing your bit in supporting our incredible NHS staff and volunteers that are working tirelessly to care for COVID-19 patients. A link to the website will be sent via Zoom, so please keep your eye out. And a big thank you to those of you that have already donated. Your support is hugely appreciated. So without further ado, I'm very pleased to welcome two terrific names in the industry, Simon Silver and Simon Allford, who will take us through the interesting history and growth of their successful businesses and careers. So firstly, my colleague, Simon Silver from Derwent London. Derwent owns a portfolio of 5.5 million square feet commercial real estate, predominantly in central London. The company's reputation has been largely founded around excellent design and proactive asset management. And some of Derwent's flagship buildings in the portfolio include T Building, Angel Building, and White Collar Factory, many of which you'll hear more about throughout this presentation due to the involvement of AHMM. Simon Silver is not only one of the founders of Derwent, but has been an indispensable part of the Derwent London brand and the creative force behind many of its successes. Simon's role focuses mainly on Derwent's projects, working closely with the teams and the wide variety of architects that have been commissioned over the years. Simon is also an honorary fellow of the Royal Institute of British Architects, which brings me nicely on to our second Simon, Simon Allford, from architectural practice, Allford Hall, Monaghan Morris. AHMM describe themselves as making buildings that are satisfying and enjoyable to use, beautiful to look at, and easy to understand. The practice is known for its reinvention of buildings and places, including the Television Centre, the Barbican and New Scotland Yard, as well as key new commercial developments in London, including White Collar Factory and the up-and-coming Soho Place, both for Derwent. Knowing how much both Simons have to say, we will need to keep an eye on the clock, but I'm sure they'll welcome questions. So please feel free to send through on Zoom, and we'll try our best to have those answered towards the end of the session. So now over to Simon Silver and Simon Allford.
I hope you're seeing an image that looks something like Simon Silver mentioned earlier, a kind of wisp of Oliver Twist. This is an image I wanted to share with you today because when Simon and I and Kane were talking about this, we wanted to we decided it'd be more interesting to tell you a bit of a diary of a conversation we've had over time. So I opened my office in 1989 with my partners after we'd studied together at the Bartlett University College. And we opened in Charlotte Street in the West End. We then moved to Allford Place. We ran out of Charlotte Street, went to Allford Place. And we'd gone from paying £30 a foot to £15 a foot. We still couldn't afford to pay that. So we went to the far east of London called Old Street. And we found a building where Jasper Morrison, the designer, and Nigel Coates, the designer, were living. And I think it was £3 a foot we were paying in rent. And it was very much like this image of Shad Thames. It was an old rag trade factory at a place that is now very much the centre of the new design quarter of London. But at the time, it felt like the very end of the world. But we went there because it was kind of engaging in an old warehouse. We thought, this is a great place to be, especially when there's only 4 of you working the business and your turnover is about £60,000. But then things changed. We moved to this building, and I believe Simon can now tell you a little bit about how Derwent acquired it. This is about 1991, 92.
Yeah, yeah, gosh. That dates us both, Simon.
It does.
Going back a few years, but we started our company in 1984, so five years or so earlier than yourself. And in those days, we were capitalized at, I don't know, £5 or £6 million. We were a small company, and we grew gradually over those formative years. And it was in the later 80s that an agent that's quite well known actually in the West End called David Rosen introduced me to a block which was a pretty rundown block, dilapidated, called Moorlands. And he told me that there was a talented firm of architects that Derwent should meet, and that maybe would be the right firm to carry some kind of regeneration, refurbishment to the buildings. I met Simon A. He told us he was 8 people, but actually they were only 4. I think he was trying to impress me. And the marriage was made, and we commissioned them, and we did, in those days, we couldn't afford to do it in one big sweep. So we did a gradual program of rolling refurbishment, as we called it, over several years. And what we loved about Moorlands was volume and light. I'd already learnt the lesson from a group of buildings that we owned in Islington, where 2 young architects, prior to Simon, I have to say, introduced us to the delights of converting light industrial premises, which was much helped by the 1987 use class order change, which allowed light industrial to become offices. And it was a moment in time, definitely for us, that we realized that industrial premises, light industrial premises, offered much more character, integrity, and most important of all, volume and light. So we were delighted to come across Moorlands and delighted to come across AHMM, and the marriage was brokered.
It was a great kind of start, because what we learnt was there's a lot of qualities inherent in good industrial buildings. They've got good volume, good robust structure, quite simple but legible elevations. And I think we only spent something like £2 or £3 million over those first few years, but it's a big project, same with the builders. I think you acquired it for a rather fantastically good price, as I recall, Simon. I didn't know at the time.
It makes, I think it will make any agents watching, it will make their eyes water, but it was 80,000 feet for 1.6 million. Although admittedly, it wasn't freehold, it was very long leasehold with a 10% gearing. But yeah, incredible to think, you know, something like 25, 30 pounds a foot.
And what we liked about it, you know, what we said was, look, that we don't need to do very much. We don't need to rush into making architecture everywhere. It had lots of staircases, lots of bridges. Let's just make it easily subdivisible. Let's keep the existing windows. Maybe we'll upgrade them over time. We talked about winning area and taking staircases out, but it involved too much capital cost. So I think the rent went slowly from about £2 a foot, £3 a foot to about £10 a foot. But it became a very successful, buzzing little development. And you know, we're still there. We had a little office of 2,000 feet. We moved, you know, following that project, we moved to a larger office within the office. And we've always enjoyed that idea of a little secret bit of London. I think that's really been something you and I have always appreciated, is discovering those kind of buildings you never knew were there. And then suddenly you walk in there and there's a magic world of basements and light and courtyards. And then I think what happened was Moorlands was rather successful, modest project, but was rather successful. And then one day you called me up and said, look, why don't you come to Hatton Garden? There was this, it was a Johnson Matthey building, it was called, this rather kind of grand, slightly over the top facade, but I haven't got a photo of it, but at the back we just found this huge empty courtyard with a kind of the world's most absurd fish tank in it, and the building had been badly renovated. They'd done a sort of modern glass overlay on the back, and we just thought this is a place where we could actually build a building and kind of go from Moorlands, where we kept a building and reworked it, to actually extending and adding to the building.
Yeah, it was of course very different to Moorlands, as you've already said, Simon. But it was a sort of an island site, and that was interesting. And there were actually buildings at the rear of the site as well, and this giant courtyard where, in property terms, we always felt surely we could extend the building, surely we could win permission to build some more space, and in fact that's obviously what we did. I mean, the floors themselves were pretty good, but you managed to find some great double height spaces at ground and first floor levels, and you introduced this wonderful atrium that was that you're showing on screen now.
Yeah, in fact, everything to the right of this image, the right-hand side, is the old building. And then in the courtyard, we managed to build a 21-meter deep new building that we bolted the new building back onto the old and added something like 70 or 80,000 feet. And we, you know, what we really pushed here from our industrial heritage together at Moorlands was the idea of timber and concrete and avoiding finishes and making a building that really feels like, you know, the way it's made is shown. You can see the pavement lights we're beginning to enjoy that we discovered at the Moorlands, the junctions of the concrete bridges. And actually, people talked about atriums as marketing features. We made what we like to call a covered courtyard. We didn't want to make an atrium, which we always thought was a bit corporate. And the idea was that people coming out the bridges were using it. It was animated by people. And it's, I mean, it's a project you still own today, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. We've held it for investment. Many of these buildings, regenerated buildings, were multi-tenanted, and we actually really enjoyed building a community of office workers within these buildings, which stood us in good stead as the investment went forward, and maybe as the area became more popular, as Hatton Garden did, and rents grew. So it was a great formula, and one that worked. And in fact, Simon, you'll probably remember, you took us on an architectural trip to New York and Chicago and introduced us to the likes of Louis Kahn and Mies van der Rohe. And it might not have been literal, but we took back from those trips little strips of materiality. And indeed, as you mentioned, timber and concrete was very much Louis Kahn, and something that we tried in a small way to emulate. And I do remember when the building was finished and there was all this exposed concrete, and I think it was one of the first buildings to have exposed concrete in those days. When the agents came round, the West End agents, a few of them remarked, well, when are you going to finish your entrance hall? You know, there was all this exposed concrete. It's not actually in this shot, but it's in the shot of the entrance. And it's funny how things have moved on, and now it's extremely popular, of course, years later.
I think it was, to us, there was always that idea together that if a building had legibility and architectural integrity and design quality, it would let. And I think importantly, I mean, it's hard to imagine now, but when we went to Hatton Garden, certain agents regarded it as the end of the world, but you managed to get a big advertising agency to move from the West End to here, which was quite a sort of important symbol, wasn't it?
Great advertising came, and they loved the building, and they were persuaded to leave the West End and come to Hatton Garden, which was in those days, you know, quite unusual. But it just shows you, if you make the space and you get the design, and everything is, you know, looking very attractive, as this building did, you can lure tenants, as we used to say, from one area to another. You know, London's a big place, and it turned out very successful.
And interesting, I remember the conversation was that these kinds of spaces, which is a triple height office, because we have this kind of rights of light cut that generates the roof, everyone was worried about it, but it's these spaces that actually prove the hooks to get people to come there. The supposed ordinary vanilla offices that everyone was comfortable with, in a way, they're the least successful and the least interesting. Volume and light were kind of key to the project's success. And then I think late 90s, early 2000, well, we were living in the end of the world, which was Old Street then. Then you took us beyond the edge of the world to a place called Bethnal Green and Shoreditch High Street, and you acquired this building. It really did feel like there was an urban motorway. It wasn't two-way. There was no bars, no life. There was a grotty pub, but there was this amazing warehouse building right on the edge of the city.
Yeah, it was. You know, they were too big into communicating warehouses, and They were used for warehouse use, and in fact, one was a bacon factory of all things. And I remember in the early refurbishments, it was trying to get rid of the smell of the bacon extracts. But they were amazing buildings, and they were big, robust, full of character, and we were immediately attracted. And not only because of that, but I think we bought 200,000 feet for about 20 million in those days. So we were paying just under £100 a foot, I think it was. And it was a joyful moment that when we started refurbishing and tenants started to come along. And again, we were successful in quite a large pre-let to Mother Advertising, which really kick-started the whole development. But it's hard to explain to people just how down in the mouth the area was at the time, Shoreditch. And I, you know, without sounding too immodest, it really was the catalyst for change in Shoreditch when this building was refurbished and the tenants started to arrive. And it's to this day a very, very popular building. Rents started off at £5 and £8, and today it's hit 65, which is not absurd when you think of some of the high rents in you know, more lucrative West End places and rents of £100 a foot. I still think it does offer you know, value.
I think also for those, you know, people who are just experiencing or about to experience this strange world we're in, and the kind of economic impact upon it, that this building, you know, when we have this joke, you know, there was a famous quote from the First World War when things were going badly and the admirals met and they said, "Gentlemen, we have no money, we have to think." I think we had been working with you on doing a Johnson. We had grand plans to cut holes and make things. And then suddenly you said, look, can we do a much, much lighter touch? You know, we're not sure that whether we're going to keep this building forever, and, you know, maybe it will be different. So we actually began with just the idea of making a little roller shutter door, taking an existing cobbled street. We bought a shipping container for £300 from Essex, from a wharf side in Essex.
That much.
It was, yeah, I kept the price quiet. And we just worked with the graphic designer, Cartley Levine and Studio Myerscough. We just said, okay, well, look, let's just put some lights in, let's clean it up. Let's use existing lifts. Mother came in, and Clive Wilkinson, who's California based, had this idea of this big table, and they were a big kind of pre-let for one part of the building. But for the rest of the building, it really was a question. I remember Simon says, well, you know, do we need to spend that much? I said to him, look, I think all we can do now is thin the paint. But what we both enjoyed, I think, was the level of detail and just the quality in the way that warehouse was put together. Let's not remove that and develop a new aesthetic. Let's work with it. And it's a building which we as an office and you as a developer have never stopped playing with. We're always moving units around. We kept the lifts. We painted the inside of the car doors. We kept the old doors. We developed a slightly better calling system. We played with some graphics. But the whole thing was an exercise in what I would call contingent design, responding to the kind of moment. And I think that's the great lesson from T, is there are so many rules we all follow, including those that become BCO rules. But actually, this building threw the rule book out of the window. It was how to spend less capital. And as a result, you were able to let much smaller businesses who were new businesses to come in on shorter leases and different kinds of terms, weren't you?
Yeah, that's right. I mean, there was that restraint that you've just mentioned, and just working with the character of these wonderful old industrial buildings, and you know, multi-let, and it is today multi-let. There are, you know, we have the sort of well over a dozen tenants, and it is a building that people really enjoy. And if somebody had said to me that Redchurch Street, which was the street at the rear of the building, was going to become a retail thoroughfare, I would never have believed it. But of course, Shoreditch has moved on in leaps and bounds, and, you know, T building is right in the centre of it, and it remains to this day, one of my favourite buildings.
I think it was while we were working on a sort of second iteration of T that we went out one day to have a look at this building, which was a very depressing government building, really kind of dark, enclosed. You didn't know where you were, but we all thought it had good bones. And I think it's not really an office district, is it? It's certainly not a kind of the district you're used to.
No, it was behind, yeah, the Horse-Free Road, and but again, what it did offer, it offered a sort of its own site. It was an important building, and it had status. And
Yeah, it's got
it
a
was
sort
a
of New
building
York
that
feel, hasn't it?
yeah, absolutely, and you know, brick and stone, very honest, and a building that we both felt we could work with and bring back to life.
And we discovered there were two courtyards that we felt we could just, again, drop. Again, the strategy for these buildings was to not to cut and carve, as people talk about, but actually to kind of carefully insert and work with them. So we had light wells. We dropped lifts into existing light wells. We didn't cut structure away. We kind of one area and made the building begin to work harder. We kept most of this building, added a floor, you know, a floor on top. And I think you took a possible tenant, you took Burberry around the Johnson building, didn't you? Which they sort of fell in love with, but they couldn't have.
That's right. And then they came down to Horse-Free Road to see this building. And I believe it was Angela Ahrens, who was the CEO at the time. And actually, she quite fancied the journey to this particular building rather than Johnson, which probably played into our favour. But another point I'd like to make, Simon, is that we never shied away. And it was something the architects like yourselves that we worked with in the early days taught us. And it was a very valuable lesson. And that sometimes was to lose square footage. We were always obviously looking to win some, but to lose square footage to create more important, attractive spaces like this atrium that you created here was a really important part of the whole overall project. And it created memorable spaces that were bright, light, and exciting. And we never shied from losing area to create bigger, better spaces.
And I think, I mean, we always talked about that journey, not just into the front door, but then the journey through the building, using stairs. All the things we talk about now were just what we thought were fundamental common sense. But you also knew Nick Jones of Soho House, didn't you? And so suddenly we shot back to tea.
Yeah, my mate David Rosen, actually, from Pilcher Hirschman, knew him and introduced him to the building. And I was invited to a meeting one day with our now CEO, Paul Williams, to meet two firms, Nick Jones's Soho House and Mother Advertising. And they'd got together, and Nick Jones sat there and said, and I think we should build a swimming pool on the roof. And Paul and I looked at each other and shrugged our shoulders and said, yeah, sounds a good idea. I never imagined it, and it exceeded our expectations, but it was a master stroke. And of course, Nick's got a great touch and has created an amazing business. And again, it brought a lot of popularity to our building to have Soho House in there with the tenants, a lot of whom became members, and to enjoy these incredible facilities.
And I think what was good is these projects were all about, they weren't do on pause. One would be carrying on, would be playing at tea, would be putting a pool in for Nick, would be going back to Johnson and making something work. And then you had this, I think I do it 2007, 8, you had this merger with LMS, didn't you? Which kind of dramatically increased your portfolio.
It was a real milestone deal. I won't go on about it too long because I know time is short, but John Burns at the time got together with Robbie Raine, who was Lord Raine's son, who ran a public company called LMS. And we were both valued at about 100 million on the London Stock Exchange. So it was a merger of two 200 million pound companies, and they had some great stock in Fitzrovia and also in this area going out towards the east again. And an amazing site. It was all let to BT, and we managed to get a surrender out of BT and let you loose on the building.
Yeah, I knew a bit about it because in my first ever job, in my summer holiday, I detailed some grills on the back of this building for Elson Pat Roberts. But the first thing we noticed was it didn't quite address the street, and it had this hole in the middle of it, which wasn't, it was a service yard really, not very much loved, but it had a really good, generous structure. And it wasn't an old building. It was only 25 years old, but it had a really good, generous structure. And we said, look, actually, and again, this comes back, nothing's new, the carbon story, and if you could keep that frame and add to it rather than take it down, we could build it quicker, we could make a better building, and we could then spend more money on what we did, as Simon said, to add the architectural quality. We kept the staircases, we kept the frame. We didn't, just like Horsefree and Johnson, we inserted elements within the holes we found. So that courtyard, we won a lot of space, but we also left this really big 12 by 15 meter courtyard, as we like to call it. And we'd learned from Johnson that actually you need when we started Johnson, people said, get me to lifts. By now, actually the journey, the idea of a cafe, a place to sit, a place to pause, there you are, Simon, in the picture.
Yeah, if you had a close-up, I look a lot younger.
Yeah.
Now.
Yeah, and again, so we were each project was a little research project that went on to the next. So this becomes a kind of a big brother of Johnson. The concrete's really become quite heroic in its scale. It's actually, that's a bridge structure there of Virendale Truss. And we really fell in love with that kind of language that we'd started to develop, and a language of making economically. So we spent quite a lot of money with Getjar on the quality of the concrete, but then there are no finishes. And you know, our view as a kind of team was always, it's the quality of really good materials, honestly made to work hard.
I think a lot of property companies, especially with a site like this, would have been very tempted to demolish and build a much bigger building. But our game was always refurbishment and regeneration in those early years, as we've shown. You know, whether it's T Building or Angel or the government building down on Horsefree Road, we loved resuscitating old buildings and bringing them back to life. And I must admit, giving your firm a really big pat on the back here, I never imagined that Angel could be converted and turned into the sort of very smooth, beautiful looking building that it turned out to be. And again, it was a little bit of a lesson that we brought back from Chicago with us when we looked at all Mies's wonderful buildings. And there's just a little bit of Miesian scale that was in that lovely frontage that you created to the building.
It's a 2 kilometer radius curve. But I mean, we won a lot of area, but we only added a floor. And I think what we all got very excited about was the idea of it becoming a kind of, we used to talk about it being a palazzo on the corner, a proper urban building. And actually, when people went in, they had no idea we'd kept the frame. They didn't know that it had been kind of recycled as a carbon story. It was really just a story of good space being used, and you know, great roof terraces. And you suddenly realize in London, you only have to get to level 5 or 6, and you've got these amazing views from Angel over, you know, St. Paul's in that case.
Yeah.
And then we went back to T. We remade the entrances. We put some new lifts in some existing light wells. We had a project we called Green Tea. We liked to name, didn't we? Green Tea was the name for kind of actually adding better access to tea, and also putting better services. And businesses like Mind Candy were growing from a tiny business. I think they got to about 25, 30,000 foot before they outgrew the building in a way. But that was one of the nice things about tea. It was sort of growing tenants and changing, and,
yeah.
and lessons we were learning could be applied.
You mentioned earlier, Simon, that, you know, do we still own the building? And, you know, we still own many of these buildings. And one of the reasons is that expression that they are buildings that keep on giving. And we revisit them every so often. It could be 10 years on, where we think it's just got a little bit tired and it needs, you know, some love and care. And we come across opportunities. And that's what I love about these buildings. You know, development's wonderful. And when you build a new building, and if you get it right, it's very fulfilling. But our game in those days was certainly more about refurbishment and regeneration.
And going back to that kind of reference to where we are today, I think it's that idea that when there's a shake-up, economic or cultural, or in this case, kind of medical, that idea about actually let's pause and let's try and use this time to think. And in 2008, I remember you and Paul Williams calling us into a meeting and saying, look, you know, we've built some great buildings, and we were still in the process of building Angel, which, by the way, Speculative Office Sterling Prize shortlist, which is a tribute really to the kind of your commitment to architecture. We said, well, look, actually, if we're building a completely new building, because as you were getting bigger as a business and looking at more challenges and bigger sites were coming in, what would it be like? What would we learn from the old buildings and all the projects we'd done? What is the research? And we embarked on a 2-year research project with Jackson Coles and Arups and AKT2 to kind of establish the rules. And we came up with the idea of tall ceilings, so like natural stack effect, big volumes. We love the light, we love the character, and we also know it works well for the environment. Smart servicing for us as a team meant actually not loads of pipes. It's more a simple technology. In this case, if you cast cold water into the slabs, you create a chilled ceiling, but you don't have the tiles and the finishes. It's embedded in the concrete. The facade itself should be maybe only 30% to the south. You should actually play with the the solids in the building and not try and make a glass building.
If I could just interrupt you, I remember that time obviously very, very fondly. And this was a different sort of project. The site was in fact a group of old and tired 60s buildings that had had their day. So development was very much, the ambition. And when we sat down at that think tank, Simon, what I remember most was us saying how successful we'd been with our industrial buildings, how much the creative tenants that we'd attracted loved, like we did, volume and light. And could we not build a new office building, but in the terms of industrial scale? And I remember when we were talking with our engineers about this new, well, very simple form of air cooling, which was in concrete core cooling, that they turned around and said, but the only thing is, if we're not going to put all the toys and bells and everything in this building, that, and sophisticated air conditioning, you will need a floor to ceiling soffit of at least 3.2 meters. And we all were rather pleased about that, actually. We thought, okay, we're not going to build another story or two, but instead we ended up, in fact, with 3.4 floor to ceiling, which was by far and away the largest floor to ceiling volume of any developer had ever created in central London offices at the time. And again, it proved extremely popular.
That's right. I mean, we were never going to build this building, but our research was all around trying to build a building. And the slogan we used to have was nothing need be added and nothing can be taken away, that everything was a self-finish, that you weren't applying plasterboard or fancy finishes. You got architecture and you got finish and you got delight from just the way you made the building. And we did this sort of research and test project. And actually, while we were doing that, you'd acquired another building, this is actually the corner of Tottenham Court Road and Charing Cross Road. And we were sort of doing that research on one building when you kind of threw us this project and said, well, what should we do here? Because Crossrail came along, didn't it? And changed your perception of this site, because you purchased the Astoria, then the Crossrail bills started to loom.
Yeah, the Astoria. I mean, we never dreamt when we bought the Astoria. We bought it because it was just a property buy. To be very honest, that it was an instinct, because it was adjacent to these low-rise office buildings that we'd bought on Charing Cross Road, and we never really dreamt that they would all form part of one big development. But along came Crossrail, and they say in life, timing is everything. And sometimes you've got to be a little bit fortunate, and Crossrail compulsory purchased the Astoria, and we demolished it on the basis that we would create a new cultural venue on the site, and we were given the privilege of placemaking and being able to build a new theatre, which is just about completing in the very near future.
That's right. Our first crack, which was never going to last, was the idea of a tower, which wasn't really our idea, but I think Crossrail were very keen to say, why can't we? We're opposite Centre Point. We had a lovely meeting with Westminster where Rosemary McQueen and Graham King said it's a lovely, lovely project, but we don't want it in our borough.
Yeah, but I remember actually the story there was because I'm a bit embarrassed. Well, not embarrassed by it, but it was never our intention to build a building like that. But if you remember, it was one Ken Livingstone, the Mayor of London, who said, why don't you build a building like another Centre Point opposite? And we were very dubious about it, but we created the model for Ken. And thankfully, very thankfully, it was never going to be accepted by Westminster. And I think
we took it forward, but we had no intention of building it. But that does happen. That's part of the process sometimes. And we were looking at these two sites, A and B, and C and D, and how you could there's a church there, Soho Square. what would we make? And we convinced Westminster that it was smart to put as much residential as you could on C and D and make this a mixed use quarter with retail, offices, and this theatre, which was a replacement for the Astoria. But initially, you know, the brief was very unclear. Then Robert Davis introduced you to Nika Burns of NIMAX.
NIMAX Theatre Group, yeah.
And we developed, I mean, this was 2008, 9, 10, 11. While we were building Angel, we developed this idea of a theatre and an office building. And it was an early idea of how this might work. But it was important we designed it because the loads we were designing for were informing the work below ground. So although we knew the building would change as the thoughts about the theatre changed, we also knew that we would be left with certain structural loads that we had to follow through. And then we went back to Moorlands while we were building White Collar, and we built 2 floors on top for us. So we had gone from being 4 people pretending to be 10 to being about 250 people pretending to be 100, actually, because being big in architecture isn't always good. But we built 2 floors on top, we built a bridge, we connected through, we bridged over. And it's again that idea about a building that keeps giving. We keep going back to Moorlands. We've just hung another bridge there now. So again, these little projects making a little place in Moorlands, in different but similar in spirit to what we're now talking about at Soho Place. And again, we learned from Angel, and we all agreed that we'd put this kind of shared rooftop amenity on the top of Moorlands. And that informed our Soho Place project, because the theatre is a significant investment for you, isn't it? I mean, it's a major complex. It's got 7 different positions. It can seat up to 600 people. It's a really highly sophisticated, it'll be a small theatre for the West End, but it'll put on the most adventurous performances, and undoubtedly, with Nika's guidance, become a kind of landmark event. It's got a club for the actors. It's got a rehearsal hall. And we also kind of agreed that we could put some offices on top of that.
Well, I do remember the conversation with Westminster, because financially, you know, and we told this to Nika many times. I mean, financially, building that theatre was a loss leader, you know, in just financial terms. And again, I think this is a lesson of a compliant borough. Westminster really wanted the theatre, really wanted our shop and office building on the corner of Oxford Street. And they were able to see through the fact that we would need some extra commercial space. And they gave us permission for a couple more floors above the theatre with its own entrance from the area of public realm. And I'm really proud of this, because I think between us, you know, we always talk about placemaking, but this is true placemaking, creation of a cultural venue, public realm leading into Soho Square. I mean, it just doesn't get much better than this. And you know, the idea that we bought some small buildings on Charing Cross Road and ended up with this wonderful development is really very heartwarming to everybody at Derwent who's been there for many years.
And actually, I have to say, extraordinarily challenging. And then we went back to T, made some new entrances. We enhanced the whole big grand street of T. Again, T's net to gross isn't great. It's driven by kind of fire regulations, but the width and generosity of T is why people keep going there. So again, it doesn't comply with the rules, and for that, it's even better. And then we took our research on White Collar and took it to this site you'd acquired on Old Street Roundabout and started playing around with how you might take that basic idea of a concrete building and actually mold it to the site and shift the core around and go to 15 floors, build a yard, make another place, and build this building that should be super low energy, super smart, naturally ventilated speculative office. This is, I think there's quite a good story about this one, Simon, you might want to recount.
Well, I have to say, you convinced us. I mean, we were always fond of building mock-ups, but the idea of building a giant mock-up to demonstrate exactly the sort of floor space that we could create was very unlikely. And I remember going to our board and saying to them, you know, well, they said, how much is this going to cost? And I don't know, I think in those days it was probably a million odd pounds or more. And I remember you actually saying, it'll be the best £1 million you've spent, because we will learn so much about the building. And we did actually use it also, Arup's engineers, to test the concrete core cooling as well here, and the fact that it would give enough cooling to these.
Yeah, this was no show suite. This was a working prototype. And I think what we had learned.
Again, the one difference I'd like to point out to most developers is Derwent always had this belief in opening windows. I mean, here at White Collar, it was an opening shutter window that you designed. But we always felt that the sort of tenants we were attracting, they wanted to have control over their own environment. It was very important to them. So this idea of an opening window, it worked really well with the sort of cooling solution that our engineers came up with. And we tested it in this mock-up, and to everybody's delight, it was a very hot summer, it worked.
I think it's also worth adding, just because it's nice in our private rooms chatting about this. The reality, of course, is over the last 25 years of working together, the amount of time we'd spend discussing a light, a detail, an edge, and a trim, and it wasn't just the technical mock-up; it was actually the chance to be sure that we were going to build the right thing. And I think when it was built, it stood out as a different way of thinking about the office. It's naturally ventilated. It has fantastic views from the south. Agents were concerned about not having big sheets of glass, but in fact, the whole success of the building is the fact that inside it's very light, but you're not loaded up. And the light through those portholes and the detail of the concrete and the particular personality and character of the building are what make it desirable and different. And there's that entrance hall, which is all about a public room like Angel. It's got 2 levels because we were saving money in footings and playing around with things. We spent money on the concrete finishes, getting some horizontal board marking, but everything is working really, really hard. And again, getting away from that idea of fit out and strip out and throw away, there's nothing here to throw away. You can add, but you can't throw away. Yeah,
and again, it turned out, I mean, again, it attracted tenants from the day go, and another multi-tenanted building with an extraordinary rooftop running track that, a bit like when Nick Jones said about the swimming pool, I remember the meeting very well when you said, well, what about London's first office rooftop running track? We all looked at each other and again shrugged our shoulders and said, why not? Sounds like a good idea. And it's brought us actually some rather good PR, and we've done some really good charity events from that roof.
And also that idea of the communal thing from the entrance to the top, the idea that the landlord is kind of making that a facility for the whole building. And we went back to Johnson at the same time and played around with that and remade parts of that. So these projects are always teaching us to go back. And then of course, Crossroad came along, and all of this dropped, and this vast site, that's the building over there on the left that you bought originally, and then you acquired all of this, and then Crossroad dropped it all. And now when I talk about the complexity, what we're really doing is we're building a building that appears to start at ground, but actually there's 4 or 5 stories of cross-rail infrastructure. And next to the theatre, there's kind of exhaust and 3 jet engines worth of noise. But this is all part of that idea of buildings changing parts of London. And of course, the cross-rail traffic, when it finally opens, will have an extraordinary effect on this area.
I don't want to sound too immodest, but just to tell our audience that the office building was pre-let to 2 tenants, and it's been a feature. I mean, I remember in the early days, the pre-lettings really didn't happen in abundance, but as we were designing these buildings and building them, they just seemed to attract tenants who realized that maybe these were above average buildings that offered a lot more. And we've been extremely successful through good design and good architecture. We've done a lot of pre-letting in most of our buildings, and this is no exception.
And I have to say the attention that's lavished on the office is lavished on the theatre. The two are a kind of very special, I think to all of us, a very special kind of pair of projects that talk across this public space. And, as you said, we never thought when we were 4 people and you were a growing property business.
We were 8 or 10.
Yeah, we would be building it. And there we are now.
No, we never dreamt.
With Lang O'Rourke, really complex construction. So we talk about the imagery, but in fact, technically, this is probably the most, I always refer to it as Swiss watchmaking. We're delivering a theatre next to a vent shaft. We've got vibration to deal with. But in a sense, it's not just the image and the idea, it's the commitment, you know, with you to knowing that we go back to buildings, that we stay on them all the way through, and build them. And, you know, back again with just opening in T, the new idea of the street, I think the new office on Redchurch Street that used to be the service yard. So these buildings are always, there's a sort of conversation across time from the finesse of this building to going back to T, a much smaller project, but just seeing how important it is to keep learning from buildings.
When you show those shots of those spaces that you just don't find in you know, in regular buildings, it makes people appreciate why we had a love of those industrial buildings, because they offer spaces that, you know, like no others, and they're rather wonderful, and I'll never tire of them.
And I think, you know, we're looking at quite a few projects at the moment and kicking around with some ideas about how to think. But I suppose, you know, we'll end now really just saying, I don't think the next thing we do is something completely different. Each project is learning, but what we have discovered in our journey is if you keep pushing the boundaries and you give, you know, the client the ability to be brave, actually, there is a long-term reward in making really good buildings that will last into the future. Because even more so now, you know, with the wellness and the Carb and all these other initiatives, but it's crazy to build buildings and throw them away every 25 years. I mean, it won't be allowed moving forward, but it was always kind of crazy. And the reason it happened is people got mean and squeezed in extra floors, and light, generosity, volume, and having fun on the way while being deadly serious, I think have been the hallmark of our collaboration, really.
Yeah, there's been a very special passion from both our two respective companies, firms, and it's worked really well over the years, and I hope it's been illustrated to everybody through the projects that you've shown on screen today. But it's been an amazing journey, and one I never ever thought I'd be taking part in when we started Derwent, you know, with 8 people. But it's been remarkable, and we're still enjoying it at this very moment, and looking forward to practical completion of Soho Place.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I shall hand back to Kane now, and Kane, over to you.
Well, thank you very much, both. That was fantastic. And there's been some lovely comments coming through, which you'll be pleased to hear. People enjoying the storytelling and the context, the why for the evolution of Derwent developments as a nice starting point. So we've had some questions. Just to kick us off, a question to both of you. You've always had your eye on underdeveloped or gentrified areas. Where's the next area of London you both have your eyes on?
Well, I can kick off. For me, that's easy to answer, because we've just recently bought a building in Brixton, and we've actually, I've got to be a little bit careful what I say, but we've had an architectural competition, 3 very good firms of architects, and we're about to make a decision on it. But we think Brixton offers amazing advantages that in many ways that Clerkenwell did years ago, and that is it's very easy to get to. From Savile Row, our office, amazingly, you can drive there in about 15 minutes, and people don't fully appreciate that. So yeah, Brixton is definitely one. An area that we never got involved in, but an area that came good was obviously Battersea, and on it goes. You know, we'll still be looking for the next area.
Yeah, I mean, I think for us, it's always been that we've been looking at going east, and we used to talk Hackney, but Hackney's been and happened and gone. But what we are looking for together, I think, is sites where you can be a bit more experimental and be a bit more brave. And we've looked at some sites in the edges of Southwark and those kinds of, you know, places where you kind of think, actually, no, we can do something here that challenges the kind of West End product. And I think that's why that kind of continuous regeneration of London's really important. And I think it's that, you know, I think David Rosen used to say, it used to be location, location, location. His line, it's now architecture, architecture, tube stop. If it's connected, people will go there. If you make a great place, you know, a great building will attract people anywhere in London if they can get to it.
So a question for Simon Allford. What are your top tips for young aspiring architects?
Get cheap rent, meet smart clients early in your career, lie about how big you are, all those things that we did. I think my most straightforward tip is find out what the project wants to be, understand what your client's ambitions are, and make architecture come out of that. It's not a secret agenda that you overlay. You don't use your client's brief as a tool that you manipulate to make your building. If you go on the journey, you're much more likely to be creative, because the problems that the client's brief will show up, the challenges, the demand for kind of light or volume or area or speed of construction or keeping a frame or recycling at parts of a building. Actually, I think it was Charles Eames said, without constraints, there is no design. So I think use constraint as your greatest friend to creativity. Don't regret it. Money, time, planning, client ambition, they should drive you, but it should never get in the way of architecture. You know, if you're open and honest, great architecture will come from those constraints.
Okay, so a question for you both. With office design coming from a corporate look to a very industrial look with open ceilings, what do you both feel is the next likely trend, and what are tenants asking for?
Maybe I'll kick off. I mean, you know, I can't exactly put my finger on it and say what tomorrow's trend is going to be. But certainly one of the experiences that I've had is learning from the past to enhance the future. And it's really interesting. And thanks to the really talented firms of architects I've worked with over many, many years, I've learned so much. And some of the great architects from the past, whether it's Mies van der Rohe, Louis Kahn, whoever, when you look back and think how ahead of the curve they were, and how important materiality was. And I think at Derwent, we're absolutely passionate about that materiality and about artisanship. And I think, you know, we'll stick with sort of, you know, those very important lessons that we've learned. Sure, things will change and we'll go with change, especially with what's going on now and COVID and everything else, you know, the design of an office space. But I still think that less is more, as Mies said, that you know, London was built of brick and stone in the day. And I think we've stuck to a regime of very simple, but very beautiful materials. And I'm sure that we won't waver that much from you know, that sort of idealism.
Yeah, I think, I mean, I'd echo that. We've never really talked about the look, the corporate look or industrial look. What we try to do is pursue, in our discussions, you know, in our collaboration over the last 25 years, we just tried to pursue what we tried to think was the best contemporary thinking. And that to us has always been about volume and light, not throwing bits of buildings away, pursuing the idea that the building is just part of the city. The journey through the front door to the staircase to the lift should be pleasant. So all the current things, carbon, wellness, you know, all these kinds of things that, you know, be honest, it's common sense that we've forgotten in our rush to meet some new kind of image of a building. And actually, if you keep following the logic of good buildings, the building will never go far wrong. Fit outs will come and go and fashions of floors will come and go, but that's not architecture. That's just kind of temporary materials. The essence of the building is, you know, that idea of a presence in the street, a generous entrance, a nice journey through it, good volume spaces, very little fit out. Let the fashions, a bit like you design an apartment block, you don't control the interiors. People will bring their furniture in. Think of an office as, you know, tenants as people who bring furniture into the stage set that you're creating.
I don't know, I know time's running out, but I've left out one very important factor, and that is we've really enjoyed artisanship over the years. You know, whilst less is more, it's still great and very fulfilling to find firms, and dare I say, it might not be very sustainable to go to Italy to get your you know, or Sweden to get your bricks, but we've absolutely enjoyed meeting some very specialist firms. I'm pleased to say that, you know, I will name drop a little bit because there's a company, Benchmark in England, that do the most wonderful, you know, joinery and timber. And we've absolutely delighted in working with these artisans. And I think they are the icing on our cake. they are the little bit of, you know, what used to be years ago, you know, when people design these more flamboyant buildings. But I think artisanship is very high on Derwent's agenda.
Yeah, I think another little golden rule we have is we always have a Bill Amberg leather detail somewhere in our project. I mean, in Johnson, it was
Bill, if you're watching, we mentioned you.
we always have a handrail, at least, if only a handrail. That's just quite a nice thing about going back to the same people, exploring a little detail. The touch of a building matters. You know, the little details add up in people's minds. People care about detail.
Okay, so a question with Boris's announcement in mind this Sunday. Are you concerned for office space and your share price?
Am I concerned? I mean, one's always concerned. You know, we're always wary. We never take anything for granted. Bust or boom, you know, we've seen it all over 35 years. Obviously, things are going to change. And we were only having this discussion the other day. I think there are two sides to the coin, actually. One is that, you know, with the offices maybe being designed with more space in mind and less people, I think we're going to be looking very hard at that. And, you know, whilst it's going to be more difficult in certain areas, I think there are pluses that people will actually require, therefore, more space. More space with less people is perhaps a plus, especially for big companies. Social distancing and how desks are arranged and interior design. So I think there's pros and cons, but I think it's a challenge that we'll all take on, and we'll create something hopefully that works and something that is also well designed, as always.
There's that thing about the office is dead, long live the office. I mean, 30 years ago with the internet, we were told that everyone would be working in barns in the country. People want to come together and meet. So I think there's a lot of great things like Teams and Zoom, and we can communicate like this to a large number of people, and that's fantastic. But actually getting into a room and meeting other people and chance encounter it's hugely important, and it will be equally important moving forward. And, you know, this is BCO NextGen. I've got a bit of accommodation, but if like a lot of my teams, you're working from home with two children, one doing piano behind you and the other dog barking and another one crying, getting to your office is positively a joy. We took another 15,000 foot of office space from Derwent in the ground floor of the white collar factory, the lower ground floor. I like to call it the ground, but it's the lower ground floor. Some might call it a basement, as what we thought was expansion space. On one level, that's madness, but we're saying actually looks like a bit of foresight now. We can space out our staff, and yeah, we can actually make a more pleasant working environment. I think some people will come in later. They will work differently. We have a lot of people already. We have a dozen people who work around the world who aren't with us anymore, who aren't in London. That's just the future. It doesn't mean the office won't exist. It just means the office may get a bit of a reboot. I think it was getting too packed, too busy. People were max packing. You know, it'll get a reboot, and that's probably a good thing. You know, we might make better office space.
And then selfishly, last question from me. Who have you looked up to for inspiration during your careers?
Simon, do you want to go first?
I was very fortunate. I had a stepbrother in John Burns who founded Derwent London back in, as I said, '84. And, you know, John was my senior. He was my stepbrother as well. Our parents had married after losing their original partners. And John was more experienced than me. He was 7 years older. And I certainly learned a lot from John in the early days of a estate agency before we became a property company. And then I think another name worth mentioning, because he's been so prolific when it comes to development in London, and that must be Stuart Lipton. And Stuart Lipton, although it's a different style of architecture to a Derwent, I mean, he's building, as we know, skyscrapers in the city and whatever, but he's had an amazing career and one that I take my hat off to. And he's certainly served as an inspiration to people like me. And I hope that at Derwent we can go on and inspire other younger people to do what we're doing as well.
I mean, for me, my father was an architect, which is why I support Sheffield Wednesday. So I have to blame him for that. It's been painful, but he was always a good advisor. He retired the day we opened. Completely, he had a huge office at the time, and we were four. But he was always encouraging, and he always said, "Stay close to architecture," and that was the best piece of advice. So my life can get very busy as consignments, but you realise that you're in it to make architecture. So stay close to architecture was his advice. And the other person who died recently, who was a real maverick, was Will Alsop. And when we were youngsters, we always admired him because he brought a bit of joy and life and fun. And architecture can get very po-faced. Will was a very seriously talented man, but he had a sense of the joy of life in every project he did. So I think you take a bit of everyone you come across who you admire.
Great. Well, I'm sure we could have carried on talking to you both for much longer, but sadly we are out of time. It's been an absolutely fascinating listen to both of you, and I'm extremely grateful to you for sharing your time and stories with us all. So thank you very much indeed. And thanks to everyone for joining us this afternoon. The next event will be an update on the Central London office markets from Savills and Cushman & Wakefield, who will also be sharing their market predictions in light of COVID-19, which will make for an interesting discussion. This will be on May the 21st, and more information will follow. Please remember to donate if you haven't already, and stay safe and stay well, and enjoy the long weekend. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank
Cheers.
you.